The old man's hands were already moving before anyone asked him to. That detail would stay with the young medics long after the day ended. The way Sergeant First Class Elias Voss, 67 years old, knees that clicked on cold mornings, back bent like a question mark, had already begun to assess the casualty while the rest of them were still arguing about protocol. His fingers pressed into the man's neck. His ear dropped close to the man's mouth. His eyes moved across the body the way a farmer reads weather, slow, certain, gathering what was needed. Nobody had invited him over. Nobody had asked. And that, right there, was the first thing the young medics got wrong about Elias Voss. They assumed that a man who moved that quietly must be uncertain. They assumed that age was a form of hesitation. They had a name for what he represented. They called it legacy thinking, which was a polite way of saying outdated, which was a polite way of saying useless. His name was on the weekend training roster as an observer. Observer. The word had been typed in italics on the printed sheet, as though even the font was embarrassed. The TCCC refresher course was held at Fort Bragg's Southern Training Annex, a stretch of low cinder-block buildings and gravel lots that smelled of motor oil and old canvas. October, the kind that bites. The Carolina sky had gone the color of old pewter since dawn, and the wind moved through the scrub pines along the fence line with a low, almost musical sound, like breath through a reed. 22 trainees, mostly 18 to 24, had arrived with gear that cost more than Elias's first 3 years of military pay combined. Bleeding control kits sealed in vacuum packaging, tourniquets with digital pressure gauges, airway devices made from materials that hadn't existed when Elias was learning to save lives in the mud of Quảng Trị Province in 1971. He sat on the tailgate of a government pickup truck and drank coffee from a thermos lid. The coffee was black. The thermos had a dent in the side from a mortar fragment, and the dent had been there since 1972, and Elias had never felt the need to replace it. The lead instructor was a captain named Derek Wall. 29. Tall, polished, the kind of man whose uniform creases could cut glass. He had a paramedic certification, 2 deployments to Kandahar, and a pedagogical confidence that filled the room before he entered it. He was good. Elias would give him that. He was genuinely, technically good. But good and complete are 2 different measurements, and the distance between them is often invisible until someone bleeds. Captain Wall had looked at the roster that morning. He had seen the italicized word. He had walked over to the tailgate, shaken Elias's hand with the careful courtesy people use on the elderly, and said with a smile that was almost kind, "We'll make sure you have a clear view, Sergeant. You don't need to exert yourself." Elias nodded, drank his coffee, said nothing. That was the second thing the young medics got wrong about him. They mistook his silence for agreement. The exercise began at 800. Simulated mass casualty scenario. A vehicle rollover with multiple trauma patients, staged with mannequins and 2 volunteer role players whose injuries had been marked with latex wounds and theatrical blood. Standard stuff. The trainees moved through their protocols with admirable precision: tourniquet application, airway management, wound packing, rapid extraction sequencing. Captain Wall called corrections. The trainees adjusted. The morning had the clean, practiced rhythm of competence. Elias watched from his tailgate. Around him, 2 of the younger medics, a specialist named Aaron Cho and a PFC named Brianna Kell, had apparently decided that an old man drinking coffee at a safe distance was an invitation for commentary. They were not cruel people. Elias had met cruel people, and these were not that. They were just young, which is its own specific kind of dangerous, because the young don't know what they don't know, and they haven't yet been afraid enough to find out. "Observer," Cho muttered to Kell, nodding toward Elias. "What do you even observe at that age? Whatever he learned, it's not in any of our manuals." Kell smiled. "Probably learned to apply pressure with his bare hand. No hemostatic gauze, no junctional tourniquet, just, vibes. They laughed, low, quick, the kind of laugh people use when they're pretty sure they're right. Elias heard every word. His hearing had been tested the previous year and was still within normal range on the left side. The right ear had taken damage in 1968 at Khe Sanh from a 60mm mortar that dropped close enough to push him off his feet and into a drainage ditch. But even the damaged ear caught the general shape of those words, and Elias had been reading the shape of condescension for nearly half a century. He said nothing. He finished his coffee. He folded the thermos lid closed. And then, 20 minutes later, the scenario changed. One of the volunteer role players, a civilian contractor named Michael Reyes, 31, who had done this kind of work a dozen times, collapsed, not as part of the exercise. The sound of it was different from the staged falls the trainees had been watching all morning. There is a particular sound a body makes when it drops without intention, a total absence of performance. And everyone present heard the difference immediately, even if they couldn't name what they were hearing. Reyes had been standing near the edge of the simulated crash site, marking notes on a clipboard, and then he was on the ground, and the clipboard was spinning slowly on the gravel. Captain Wall called it immediately. "This is not a drill. Somebody call 911. Now!" The trainees moved fast. They moved well, in the way that people perform under observation. Cho reached Reyes first, dropped to his knees, opened his trauma kit. Kell was right behind him. 3 others clustered at the margins, ready to assist. Reyes was breathing. Barely. His color had gone the wrong kind of pale, a grayish tint that started at the lips and spread outward. His pulse, when Cho found it, was rapid and thin, the kind of pulse that doesn't carry much blood and knows it. There was no visible wound, no blood. The staging makeup on his forearms from earlier in the exercise made the assessment confusing for a moment, because the eye kept being drawn to the theatrical injuries and away from the real crisis underneath. Cho began running through his march protocol: massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia. He spoke each step aloud, training voice, controlled. He was doing everything correctly by the manual. Reyes kept declining. The pulse thinned. The breathing grew shallow. Cho's controlled voice began to carry a current underneath it, something tight and close to panic, the way a cable sounds before it snaps. He looked at Kell. She was already on the radio with 911. EMS was 12 minutes out. 12 minutes is a comfortable margin in many emergencies. In some emergencies, it is a lifetime. Captain Wall knelt beside Cho. He looked at the patient. He looked at his medic. Something crossed his face, not panic, not incompetence, but the specific expression of a man encountering a problem that doesn't fit the shapes he's learned. His mouth was slightly open. His hand was resting on his knee without moving. Elias Voss was already walking. He moved without hurrying, which is a different thing from moving slowly. His boots crunched on the gravel in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and he was already pulling items from the canvas bag he'd carried all morning, the one the trainees had assumed was personal belongings. A lunch, maybe. Something for an old man's comfort on a cold day. He knelt beside Reyes on the opposite side from Cho, and for 3 full seconds he did nothing but look. His eyes moved across the man's face, his neck, his chest, the angle of his jaw, the way his shoulders sat, the color beneath the staging makeup on his arms. His left hand pressed into Reyes's upper abdomen, not aggressively, deliberately. Tension pneumothorax. His voice was quiet, flat, the way a man names weather rather than announces it. Left side. The tracheal deviation's subtle, but it's there. Feel his neck, right at the notch. Cho blinked. He looked at Captain Wall. Wall gave one slow nod. Do it. Cho's fingers found the notch of the sternum, traced up toward the trachea. His face changed. He felt the shift. The trachea barely had migrated right. Elias was already uncapping a needle, a 14-gauge, 3.25-inch catheter from his canvas bag. The bag had a red cross stenciled on the side, faded to pale pink by perhaps 30 years of sun, and several of the trainees who were now pressing in from the margins would later say they had seen it all morning and assumed it was decoration, the nostalgic kit of a sentimental old man who liked the look of the thing. "You're going needle decompression," Wall said, not quite a question. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." Elias's fingers found the landmark without looking. His eyes were on Reyes's face. "Hold still for me, son," he said to Reyes quietly, in a voice that had said that same sentence in a rice paddy in 1969, in a fire base in Quảng Trị in 1971, in a ditch outside Khe Sanh in 1968, in more places than the young medics around him could find on a map. He said it the way you say a thing when you've said it enough times that it carries weight by itself, like a hand on a shoulder. He inserted the needle. The hiss was immediate. A small, distinct escape of air, the sound of pressure released, and Reyes's chest rose differently on the next breath, fuller, less labored. His color, over the next 40 seconds, began to shift back from gray toward something closer to human. Nobody spoke. The wind moved through the scrub pines. Cho's mouth was open. He closed it. He looked at his own hands, then at the old man's hands, and in that moment he was doing the arithmetic of the thing, the difference between knowing a procedure from a course and carrying a procedure in the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions under conditions he had never faced. Elias secured the catheter. He watched Reyes's breathing stabilize. He checked the pulse at the wrist, slower now, steadier, a pulse that had found its footing again. He reached into his canvas bag and produced a chest seal, the simple, vented kind that had existed in various forms since the Vietnam era, and applied it with the spare efficiency of a man performing a task he has performed a great many times. Wall had moved around the patient to crouch beside Elias. He watched without speaking. His instructor's authority had not vanished, but it had changed shape. He was no longer the man at the front of the room. He was, at this moment, a student, and he was honest enough to know it. "How did you see it?" Wall finally asked. Not defensively, with genuine openness. Nothing in his presentation was textbook, no penetrating trauma history, no obvious chest involvement. Elias looked at the sky for a moment. The gray had lightened slightly toward the east, the way Carolina sky does in the late morning when the sun finally burns through. "Staging makeup on his forearms," he said. They'd bent his arms for the exercises. The veins in his left forearm were distended more than his right. Pressure building on that side for a while. Could have been spontaneous. Tall man, thin build. He glanced at Reyes. "What's your height, son?" 6'2", Reyes said. His voice was still weak, still air-thin, but present. "Spontaneous pneumothorax," Elias said, mostly to Wall. "Young, tall, thin men. Goes tension if it sits long enough. I've seen it twice before in the field. Once in '69 at a fire base outside Jong Ha. Man never had a scratch on him. Just dropped." He paused. "We didn't have the right equipment that time." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The EMS unit arrived at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The paramedics moved to Reyes quickly, assessed him, confirmed the catheter placement, and looked up from their work with an expression that medics produce when they find that someone has already done the essential thing correctly before they arrived. One of them, a woman in her 40s with the kind of face that has seen most things, looked at Elias's hands on the sealed chest, and then at Elias's face, and she gave him a short, precise nod, the nod of one professional to another. Nothing extra. Everything necessary. Reyes was loaded and en route to Cape Fear Valley Medical Center within 4 minutes. His condition at intake was documented as stable. The training annex was very quiet after the ambulance left. 22 trainees stood in the gravel and the October wind. Some of them looked at each other. Most of them looked at Elias, who had returned to the tailgate of the government pickup truck and was filling his thermos lid from the thermos again. His movements were unhurried. The canvas bag sat beside him, closed. Captain Wall walked toward him. Cho walked behind Wall, close, the way a man walks when he wants to say something and isn't sure he deserves the space to say it. Wall stopped a few feet from the tailgate. He looked at Elias for a moment with the particular expression of a man who is recalculating something fundamental. "Sergeant Voss." He stopped. He started again. "How long were you a combat medic?" Elias considered the question as though it required genuine thought. 23 years as a medic, 31 total, 3 tours Vietnam, 1 Grenada, advisory work in El Salvador, 83 to 85. I stopped counting individual procedures around 1975 because the count stopped meaning anything useful. Wall absorbed this. Cho stepped forward. He was a young man whose face up close was younger than his confidence had suggested. He had the look of someone who has just done the specific calculation of how wrong they were and found the number uncomfortably large. "I said something this morning," Cho began, "about your methods, about—" "I know what you said." Elias's voice carried no heat. "You said I learned to apply pressure with my bare hands. No hemostatic gauze. Just vibes." He let a moment pass. "You weren't entirely wrong. First 2 years, that was about all I had." He looked at his hands around the thermos lid. "You learned to compensate. You learned to see what the equipment would tell you. Because if you wait for the equipment to tell you, sometimes the man is gone before you hear the answer." Cho looked at his boots. Then he looked up. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Voss." Elias looked at him for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who has measured people across a considerable stretch of time and has developed a fairly accurate instrument for the purpose. "Don't be sorry," he said. "Be better. That's what the apology is for." Cho nodded. He meant it. Elias could see that he meant it. There is a thing that happens in the files of the military that most people never encounter. The paperwork that documents what a man did before the paperwork he carried into the room. Elias Voss had a file. Captain Wall had looked at the roster that morning and seen Observer, SFC Voss, Retti, and had read it as most people read the word observer, which is to say he had read it as a man reading the end of a sentence rather than the middle of one. What the roster had not contained, because rosters do not contain such things, was the Silver Star citation from 1971, the one that described, in the careful, compressed language of military citations, how Sergeant Voss had maintained a casualty collection point under continuous mortar fire for 6 hours at a firebase south of the demilitarized zone, treating 19 wounded Marines with equipment that ran out after the 4th hour, improvising the remainder from what the firebase had on hand, which was not much. 11 of those 19 men had walked out. 3 more had survived to evacuation. The citation used words like extraordinary valor and exceptional medical skill and conspicuous disregard for personal safety. Elias kept the citation in a shoebox under his bed in Fayetteville, beneath a stack of letters from his sister in Raleigh and a photograph of himself at 24, standing outside a medical bunker in Quảng Trị with 2 other corpsmen whose names he still said out loud sometimes when he was alone, because saying them kept something alive that he was not ready to let go quiet. Captain Wall found out about the Silver Star at 1600 that afternoon, when the battalion sergeant major pulled him aside and showed him the file on his phone screen with the particular expression of a man delivering information that he expects will sting. Wall read the citation twice. He stood very still while he read it. At 16:30, he walked back out to the training annex, where Elias was helping 2 of the younger trainees practice needle decompression landmarks on a simulation torso, his voice patient, his hands steady, the canvas bag open beside him. Wall waited until Elias had finished the demonstration. Then he said, without preface, "I owe you a different kind of respect than I gave you this morning, Sergeant Voss." I looked at the word on the roster and I stopped looking. Elias set the simulation torso down. He looked at Wall for a moment. "Most people do," he said. Then, after a pause, "You didn't freeze when it happened. You assessed, called it, kept your people moving. That matters." Wall absorbed this with the expression of a man who has just been given something he didn't think he'd earned. "The citation says 11 Marines walked out of that fire base," Wall said. "The citation says a lot of things." Elias picked up the canvas bag. "The ones who didn't walk out. I think about them too. That's the part the citation doesn't have a word for." He said it without drama. The way a man says something he has carried a long time and no longer needs to make smaller to be comfortable. Just the weight of it, acknowledged. The trainees who had gathered nearby, and most of them had drifted back in by then, drawn by something they couldn't articulate, a gravity that certain people generate when they finally occupy the full space of who they are, stood in the October light and said nothing. Cho's hands were at his sides. Kel had her arms crossed, not defensively, but the way people hold themselves when they're cold, and also trying to hold something in. Elias zipped the canvas bag and slung it over his shoulder. He put on the faded ball cap he'd left on the tailgate, army green, the color mostly worn out, a single black eagle on the front that had faded to the ghost of a bird. "One more thing before I go," he said, turning back to face them all. The gathering had become unofficial. Nobody had arranged it. It had simply formed the way certain things form naturally around a center. "You have the best equipment in the history of military medicine. Every piece of it is better than what I had. Every protocol in your manual. Somebody died so that protocol exists. Honor that. Learn everything in your manual until it's in your sleep." He looked out toward the fence line and the pines. "And then learn what the manual can't carry. The manual tells you what to look for. Time tells you where to look." He walked to the parking lot. The trainees watched him go. Nobody said anything for a while after the sound of his truck engine faded. Cho stood in the gravel with his hands in his pockets. He was doing that calculation again, the one about the distance between what he'd thought he knew and what he'd just seen. The number was still large. It might always be large. He was beginning to understand that large was not the problem. The problem was pretending the number was small. Kel stood next to him. "The vibes comment," she said quietly. "Yeah," Cho said. "I'm going to think about that for a while." "Yeah," Cho said again. "Me too." The Silver Star citation, if you look it up, and Captain Wall did that evening, sitting at his desk in the BOQ with a glass of water, he